Hey, welcome back to Mr. Ace Math. This lesson is on percents. Some stuff you should know before you begin this lesson are reducing fractions, how to solve proportions, and how to set up proportions. So make sure you know those and let's get started. So what exactly is a percent? Well, let's start off with the word itself, percent. Now the word percent can actually be broken up into two separate words, per and cent. The per just means out of, and the cent is just a prefix that means 100. So when you say per cent, you're really saying it's just a fraction out of 100. Even though we don't write it as a fraction out of 100, it still represents a fraction where your denominator is 100. And if you look at the percent symbol and move some stuff around, it looks like the number 100. So let's start with the percent proportion. This proportion formula will stay the same all the time no matter what. And let's start with a question. What is 75% of 200? Well, this is the percent proportion. It says part over whole equals percent over 100. Now before we start plugging numbers into the proportion, I want to talk about little key things that will help you set it up. One key thing is that when we see the word of, that really talks about the whole. Just think about that for a second. We're talking about the part of the whole. So if we said we had a certain amount out of 450, then it would be 450 where the whole goes in your proportion. So it would go here. The number 100, it never changes because every percent is out of 100. We said that before. So every percent's out of 100, so your denominator is going to stay the same always. This will always be 100. This is basically just whatever your percent in the problem is. So you can look for a percent sign, and whatever's next to your percent sign, you're going to put right in that spot of the proportion. The part, sometimes you might use the word is as a keyword to help you notice what the part of the proportion is, but I wouldn't focus too much on that because the wording of a question can change. So I would focus on looking for the word of, which tells you what the whole is, the percent symbol, which tells you what goes here in your proportion, and the 100 is never really an issue because that always stays the same. So now let's get started. We have 75%. Well, that's going to go here in the top right part because that's where our percent sign was. So we're saying 75 out of 100. This is exactly what a percent is. It's just out of 100. So it's 75 over 100. We're looking for what 75% of 200 is. And since we're saying of 200, that's going to be our whole. So now we've got our percent, we've got our whole, we've got 100. The only thing missing is the part. We're trying to find what part of 200 is 75%. Well, so we'll put a variable there. Now we've got our proportion, and all we have to do is cross multiply, then divide. Step 1 is to cross multiply, but we can actually reduce 75 over 100, and that's going to make our life a lot easier. And if we reduce that, we're going to get 3 over 4. Do we have to reduce? No. But reducing now means a lot less work later. So here's where solving a proportion comes into play. We have to make sure that we know those two steps. Step 1 is to cross multiply, so let's start doing that. That means we're going to multiply 4 times x, and that's going to give us 4x. We're going to bring down our equal sign, and then cross multiply the other way. We still have to cross multiply 3 times 200, and that's going to give us 600. So now I've got 4x equals 600. The second step of solving a proportion is just to divide, and the reason why we divide is to get the variable x by itself. So in order to get x by itself, we have to cancel out the 4, so we're going to divide both sides by 4. And when we do that, the 4's cancel, and that leaves us with x. We bring down our equal sign, and then what's 600 divided by 4? Well, that's going to be 150. So our answer is x equals 150. And if we put that back in, and we have 150 over 200, if we reduce it, that's going to be 3 over 4, which makes these two equal. And what we're saying is that 75% of 200 is 150. How about this one? First of all, let's take a look at what we have in the question. We have 12.5%. So where do you think that's going to go? Well, it's our percent. So where does the percent go in the proportion? That goes right up here in the percent part. So we'll put 12.5 there. Then we said 12.5% of 350. And remember, whenever we say something is out of a number, we're saying that that number is our whole. So we're saying it's out of 350, so 350 is our whole, so we'll put it here. And we're asking is what? Well, we have our percent, we have the whole, we have the 100, which never ever changes, so we have to find the part. And that's going to be what? So let's give it a variable, W. So now we have our proportion set up. Now we just need to solve it. So we'll cross multiply, then divide. So let's cross multiply first. When we do that, we'll have 100 times W, which is 100W. Bring down the equal sign, and then we cross multiply the other way. 350 times 12.5. And that gives us 4,375. Well, what do I do next? Well, the second step of solving proportions is to divide. And what do I divide by? I divide by whatever's in front of our variable. In this case, it's 100, because that's going to help me isolate my variable. So I'll divide both sides by 100. These hundreds cancel, leaving me with W by itself. So now I've got W, bring down the equal sign. Well, what's 4,375 divided by 100? Well, that gives us 43.75. So the part in the proportion is 43.75. How about in this example? It's a little bit different because we have different things. Our question says, what percent of 275 is 15? Well, remember, we should always try to find out what the whole is, because that's one of the easiest things to see, because of is a very important keyword. And the other thing is the percent, because we'll just have a number with a percent sign right next to it. So let's see what we can find. Well, we have 275, and we're saying what percent of 275. So we're basically talking about a part out of 275, so that's going to be our whole, which means it goes where? Down here where the whole belongs. So that's going to be 275. I also have the words what percent. So basically when I say this, does that mean I have a percent, or I'm trying to find what the percent is? Well, it means I'm trying to find what the percent is. We don't have a number here. We're trying to find out what the percent is. And in order to do that, we just put a variable where this belongs. So we'll put the variable t, because we don't know what the percent is, and that's what we're trying to find. So in the percent, that's going to be our variable. And here we're saying what percent of 275 is 15. So we're saying if we have 15 basically out of 275, so 15 is going to be our part. So here we have 15 over 275 equals t over 100. There's my proportion. Can I reduce to make things easier? Yeah, 15 and 275 can both be reduced by 5. So when I do that, I get 3 over 55. So now that I have my fraction reduced, I can just cross multiply then divide, the regular process for solving a proportion. So first I'm going to multiply 55 times t. That's going to give me 55t. Then I'll bring down my equal sign. And then I'll cross multiply the other way, 100 times 3, and that gives me 300. So now I've got 55t equals 300. Well, how do I get my variable by itself? I have to divide both sides by 55. My 55s will cancel, and that will leave me with t. Bring down my equal sign. And what's 300 divided by 55? That's going to be 5.45 repeating. So basically, and there's one thing I want to mention here. When you're talking about finding a percent, they normally don't put it as a repeating decimal. Normally they'll have it as a mixed number. But that all depends on how they ask you to answer the question. So if they ask you to round to the nearest tenth, you would say it's 5.5%. Or if they ask you to round to the nearest whole, you would say it's 5%. But either way, I just wanted to make sure you know how to calculate. So here we have our percent is t equals 5.45 repeating. So here we have a word problem, so it's a little bit different. But no matter, we're going to set up the proportion the same way we've been doing, so there's really nothing to stress about. You just got to be able to just take a deep breath, read the question, remember what we've said, and place things where they belong. So let's start. Jason played basketball. He shot the ball 26 times. He made 6 shots. What percent of shots did he miss? So let's see what we have, what we know. We know that he shot the ball a total of 26 times. So if he shot the ball a total of 26 times, that represents a total, or the complete number of times he shot, which makes it our whole. So we're going to put the 26 where the whole belongs. Well, what else do we know about Jason? We know that Jason made 6 shots, but the key thing to remember, and this is so important, is that he made 6 shots. But are we looking for the percent of shots he made? No, we're looking for the percent of shots he missed. So think about this. If he made 6 shots and shot the ball 26 times, how many times did he miss? Well, that would be 20 times. And that represents the part because that's the number out of 26 that he actually missed. So that's 20 here. 20 is not the percent. It represents the part of the whole. The 20 shots of the total 26 that he missed. And that leaves us with the only thing missing as the percent. And that's fine because that's what we're trying to find, which means we have to give it a variable. And we'll choose the variable B for baskets. You could use the variable S, but I try to stick away from using the variable S because it resembles the number 5 and it's easy to get confused. So now that we've got our proportion set up, which I honestly think is probably the most difficult part when you have a word problem, all we have to do is solve our proportion, so we just cross multiply then divide. But first, is there any way we can reduce to make our life easier? Yeah, 20 and 26 are both even numbers, so we can reduce by 2 and that gives us 10 over 13. So now we'll just cross multiply and then divide. So we'll cross multiply 13 and b, and that's going to give us 13b. We can bring down our equal sign and then cross multiply the other numbers. 10 times 100, and that gives us 1,000. And then we have to get b by itself, so we'll divide both sides by 13. Our 13s will cancel. That leaves us with b. Bring down our equal sign. And what's 1,000 divided by 13? That's going to give us 76.9. Well, that basically means that Jason missed about 77% of his shots. And think about it. It just makes sense. 77% is a high number of shots. Well, he missed a lot. He missed, remember, we said 20 out of 26. So our answer seems reasonable. And that's really important to make sure that when you have a word problem and you're applying percents to it, that it makes sense. So again, Jason missed about 77% of his shots. How about this one? We've got 31 is 20% of what? Well, what do we have? We have 20%. So we'll put that where the percent belongs. So 20 goes there. And then we're saying out of what? Remember, the of tells us basically what our whole is. Since we don't know what our whole is, we're going to put a variable there. And that's going to be the variable c. And then we're saying 31 is 20% of what? Basically, 31 of what is 20%. We can mix our words around, it doesn't really matter. And that's going to be our part. So now we've got 31 over c equals 20 over 100. Well, now we have our proportion. Can we reduce to make our life easier? Yes. 20 over 100 reduces to 1 over 5. So now we just cross multiply then divide. So we'll multiply 1 times c, which gives us 1c. We bring down our equal sign. And then 5 times 31 is 155. There's no real division that needs to be done because 1c is just c by itself. So we know that equals 155, and that's our answer. And here we have another word problem. Again, just take a deep breath, read carefully, and you'll be fine. It says, you took a test and got 85%. If on the entire test you got 68 correct, how many questions make up the entire test? Well, what do we know? We know that we got an 85%. And remember, a percent on a test represents how much of it that you got correct. So that's going to be put there, 85. What else do we have? We know that we got 68 correct. Well, remember, 85% represents the number that you got correct, which means that that is going to be here. That's our part, how much of the test we got correct. And it asks how many questions make up the entire test. Well, the entire test represents the whole because it makes up the entire test, the whole thing. The same way our denominator here, the 100, represents one whole when it's out of 100. Which means that we're going to put a variable in for our whole. Let's choose the variable q. Q for questions. So now we've got 68 over Q equals 85 over 100. Well, we've got our proportion set up, but can we reduce? Yes, we can reduce 85 over 100 by 5, and that gives us 17 over 20. Now that I've got my proportion set up, I'll just cross multiply and then divide. So I'll just cross multiply 17 times Q, that gives me 17Q. I'll bring down my equal sign, and then multiply 68 times 20, and that will give me 1,360. Now I need to get Q by itself, so I'll divide both sides by 17. My 17 will cancel, I'll bring down my Q, bring down the equal sign, and what's 1,360 divided by 17? Well, that gives me 80. Therefore, there were 80 total questions on the test. And again, it's good to see if your answer makes sense. Here we're saying that you got 85% on your test, which means you got almost all of it right, 85%. A majority of your tests you got correct because 85% is a good grade. So if there were 80 total questions, you got 68 questions correct, which is basically like saying you got a majority of the questions correct. Therefore, our answer seems reasonable and it makes sense. So here's your pause and practice. Just pause and practice. When you're done, unpause the video. After a 3, 2, 1 countdown, your answer will be displayed. Go. So let's review our answers. Number 1 is 76. Number 2 is 60. Number 3 is 5%. Number 4 is 30. And number 5 we'll go over together on the next page. So again, another word problem. Like I said, read it carefully, take a deep breath, and just think about what you have. In a school election, Michael and Jake were running for class president. Michael won, receiving 60% of the votes. If Jake receives 250 votes, how many total students voted? Seems very tricky, but let's think about what we have. We know Michael won, receiving 60% of the votes, but that was Michael. And we know that Jake received 250 votes. So this one's more difficult because there's two different people and really two different sets of information. But what we have is we know that Jake received 250 votes, which was part of the total number of votes. So what Jake got is going to help us more than what Michael got, but we still need this information too. Now, let's use Jake's information to help us. We know that Michael won, receiving 60% of the votes, but how many votes did Jake receive? Well, he received 40% of the votes. Because Michael got 60, Jake was the only other person, therefore he got 40%. Now we also know that Jake's 40% was the same thing as 250 votes. Remember what we said about proportions. The tops have to represent the same things and the bottoms have to represent the same things. The top here represents Jake's information, the percent of votes that he had and the actual number of votes he had. Now that we've got that set up, we need to find how many total students voted. Since 100 represents the total number of students, as a percentage out of 100, we're going to put our variable here, V for votes, to represent the total number of student votes. So now that we've got our proportion set up, we can cross multiply and divide, but we should always reduce when we can. Here we can reduce 40 over 100 to 2 over 5, and then we'll cross multiply. 2 times V is 2V. We'll bring down our equal sign and then multiply 250 times 5, and that gives us 1,250. I now need to divide both sides by 2. The 2's will cancel. That leaves me with V by itself. I'll bring down the equal sign, and then 1,250 divided by 2 gives me 625. That means there was a total of 625 students that voted. So let's review. The word percent literally means out of 100. The keyword to help you identify the whole of the proportion is of. To identify the percent section of the proportion, you should look for the percent sign or the word percent. Remember, normally if the percent is given, you'll have a number right next to the percent sign. But if we don't have the percent given, or if we have to find the percent, you'll normally see something like what percent. When setting up the percent proportion, which section will never change? The 100, the bottom right section of the proportion, that 100 will always stay the same no matter what because every percent is out of 100. True or false? Reducing a side of the proportion will affect the final answer. The answer is false. It just makes our life easier if we reduce, but the final answer will always be the same.
Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
And thanks for using Mr. Ace Math. Don't just pass math, ace it.